this kicked off. Hello and welcome. My name is Kate Johnson. I'm the Associate Director of Faculty Development here at UAGC. I'll be the host of this session from A to Gen Z, understanding the unique learning needs of our youngest students. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session is being recorded and will be shared with TLC-related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, we have enabled live transcription. If you would like to use it, click on the live transcription button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Vogel, Associate Director of the Academic Engagement Center, and Dr. James Metz, Associate Professor in the Academic Engagement Center.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. All right.
Thanks, Kate.
Yes. So our agenda for today, we're going to have a quick introductions, welcome, and 2 poll questions. Then we're going to take a look at who is Generation Z, what are their learning needs and styles, and then some specific practices in online classrooms, and then some discussion and Q&A if we have time, that is. Okay.
So let's open with a couple of polls.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Hang on one sec, James. So Kate already introduced us, but here we are again. That's us. I wanted to share with you before we jump into the polls, what prompted us to do this. As you'll hear throughout our presentation, we have a couple of Gen Zers amongst us. Between the 2 of us, we have three of them. So from left to right, on the left is my son Andy, who's 15. My son Sam is 20, and then James's son Brighton, who is 23. All of whom are Gen Zers. Okay, yeah, James, can you do the polls?
Now we've got a few polls for you. Let me launch them. Okay, the first one is, what generation are you? Okay. We've got about 73%. If you want to put in your answer, go right ahead. We'll give a few more seconds. Okay, and we'll see what we are. All right, we are like Jen and myself, predominantly Gen X, not Gen V, Gen X. With some baby boomers and millennials. None of those who we're about to talk to you about are present. One more question. If you have children, what generation are they? Okay. And we've got a good mix with predominance of not applicable.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you, James. Okay. All right, so we're going to get into who is Generation Z. We'll start with this quote. It is clear that a culture that has been shaped by the values, standards, and policies of one generation isn't necessarily going to be compatible with the next generation that comes through the door. So just something to keep in mind. All right. So on this chart, you can see the most recent, I believe it's census data of where the generations lie throughout the United States. So we do have some folks who are from that very first generation where we started to look at them as generations, the greatest generation born before 1928. Then we have some silent generation, baby boomer, and as we know that's a big generation, Generation X like James and myself, then millennials, and then Generation Z. So right now, Generation Z, born between 1997 and 2012, are currently from the ages of 10 to 25. That's a big range. The oldest may have just finished college and the youngest might be in 5th grade. So quite a lot of difference. Gen Z students tend to be children of Gen Xers, like we mentioned. And if you are curious as to know what comes after, for what I can tell so far, Generation Alpha is going to be next, because these are kids born between the mid 2010s and mid 2020s, making them the first generation completely born in the 21st century. So that's what's coming up next. This slide I wanted to share with you to take a look at the differences between millennials and Generation Z. So the generation that came right before them. You can see millennials mostly raised by baby boomers, Gen Z mostly Gen Xers. Millennials growing up in an economic boom, Gen Z recession. Idealistic versus pragmatic, focused on experiences versus money. Mobile pioneers versus mobile natives or digital natives. A couple other things. Millennials, Generation Z tend to be more focused on issues of social justice than millennials. Millennials went to college and accumulated debt. Gen Z, as James is going to talk about a little bit later, are college, they're thinking about it, and they're very aware, though, of the money that is going to come from going to college. Gen Z tend to have stronger work ethic. They're not as overconfident as millennials, and they're sometimes criticized for that. Gen Z is the most racially diverse generation. About 49% are non-white. 1 in 4 is Latinx. Again, focus on social justice, inequality, digital activism. They're increasingly self-aware, self-reliant, innovative, goal-oriented, and pragmatic. All right. So we are, of course, we are shaped by life events that we experience in our lifetime. So for Gen Z, it's living in that post 9/11 world. They were most of them were born after that happened, but what did the world look like after that happened as opposed to before? The election of Barack Obama, increased school shootings, movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and of course, COVID-19. Gen Z, their main concerns, environment and climate change, the rights of LGBTQ+ folks, feeling anxious about the rising cost of college, and gun violence and safety in general. So I want to say something about COVID-19. This generation was in line to inherit a strong economy with record low unemployment. That has all changed since COVID-19. So instead of looking towards a world of opportunities, they kind of are looking into a rather uncertain future. The last thing I want to mention before I hand this over to James is Gen Z and mental health. I know there's a lot of information here on the screen, so I'll just start with the chart there on the left, where we have over 70% of Gen Z citing anxiety and depression as a major problem, or in the majority, a major or a minor problem. So definitely something that is a concern for them, followed by bullying, drug addiction, etc. For their top concerns, you can see cost of living, climate change, unemployment, etc. In total, about 18% of Gen Z people experience some sort of mental health struggle. Anxiety is the most common. This percentage is higher among females, and nearly 50% of Gen Z feel more stressed since the pandemic. They tend to be more anxious and uncertain than millennials, and they seek happiness through good relationships with friends and family. So that is definitely important to them. With our 24-hour news cycle, they tend to be very hyper aware of world problems, very aware of their online image. The idea of digital reliving, which is going back and reviewing that thing that you posted to see if somebody else liked it, and how that you might feel a heightened sense of rejection if someone didn't like your post. Cyberbullying, of course, we know that's a thing now. 2 acronyms you maybe have heard of: FOMO. I think we've heard of that fear of missing out, but also FOBLO, FOBLO, that fear of being left out. And all of this is heightened for females more than males. Okay, so James, I'll hand it over to you now for learning styles and needs.
Okay, before we get into this, one of the things that I really want to address is that because Gen Z is just really kind of starting to enter higher education in full force, much of this is new data, much of it is also still speculative. And so we're really talking about what we can prepare for what we can anticipate, and certain things that we can begin to employ in higher education as we anticipate the arrival and matriculation of these students. So next slide, please. Thank you. So here at UAGC, our students by generation from 2005 to 2006 were predominantly boomers, then greater percentage of Gen X, and the past 2 years or our current enrollment shows that millennials make up the largest portion of our enrollment, and Gen Z are coming in force. So we expect naturally to see many more of them in the coming years. Next slide. Okay. And we can see this also reflected in projected workforce percentages. And as we are preparing our students to enter the workforce, we can see that by 2040, that will be predominantly comprised of Gen Z students or workers. Okay, next slide. So one of the things that we were thinking about in thinking about how we can capture the learning needs and styles of Gen Z students, and we're trying to separate ourselves from our kids because they're a little too close to us, but we also are learning from them. So 5 words that we think really capture the learning needs and styles of Gen Z students. Relevance. Is it relevant to me and to my intended career? Personalization. Can I make my own way through this? Can I learn in a way that is personal to me and again, relevant to my personal goals? Pragmatism. Is this useful? Is it something that I can put to work? Inclusivity. Am I seeing myself represented, and am I seeing people I know and want to see represented, included? Am I feeling included in a larger community? And anxiety, again, mental health is something that our Gen Z students are perhaps more aware of than any generation before them. Okay, next slide. So some things that really influence our Gen Z students' learning needs and styles, that they're used to using up to 5 screens at a time, flipping through screens. This is that FOMO, that fear of missing out, right? We have, I don't know how many of you have a million browser tabs open right now. I'm one of them across multiple screens, right? They prefer video-based platforms. 2/3 of them use YouTube to learn. I know, I was a guitar player. My son said, I don't want to learn from you, Dad. I learned how to play on YouTube and now I'm better than you. I can't speak for his taste, but nonetheless, using YouTube to learn, it's available, it's open source. Students are accustomed to having that access. Partly because of these things, Gen Z students have shorter attention spans. So we might need to incorporate entertainment, humor, again, video, to balance more serious concerns. They also expect customization or an a la carte approach to education. And I think a lot of this stems from these ideas of pragmatism, right? Of personal choice, of learning from YouTube, saying, I want to know about this, and then going to YouTube to find out and learn. I was learning about sourdough starter earlier, so I'm not, this is not exclusive to Gen Z students. So they expect customization. And again, I mentioned that these are things that we can anticipate, things that we can begin to prepare for. I know that institutions, educational institutions in particular, don't move as quickly as we might want to. students expecting an a la carte approach often goes against our structured sequences, of course, sequences, right? So figuring out a way that we can give them some sense of an a la carte approach without completely rebuilding the wheel, or maybe we do rebuild the wheel. They also prefer an intrapersonal learning rather than interpersonal learning. They like to learn next to, but not necessarily with others. This also, I think, is something that stems from the pandemic, right? We have this, and especially younger peers now have this sense of wariness in social spaces. But at the same time, they seek inclusive and communal spaces. So I want to feel part of, I want to feel included, and yet I want to be next to you, but not too close. So next slide. Some specific practices in the online classroom. Some of you may have just attended a session 2 hours ago that I gave on incorporating the diversity, equity, and inclusion rubric in course design. You might see that that is the #1 topic in this list. Some specific practices that we are currently using in UAGC courses and course development. We mentioned that Gen Z is the most racially diverse generation to have existed in the US. Making sure that these students feel seen, feel represented, and feel connected in the classroom is something of huge importance. And using that DEI rubric, we have ours at UAGC. If you're at another institution, it's likely that your institution has one as well, or maybe you need to develop it. There are resources out there for you to do that. But using that diversity, equity, and inclusion rubric in course development and design prepares you to create that inclusive space environment for students. Providing choice in discussions and assignments, giving students options to feel like they're actually participating in the organization and structure or scaffolding of their own education, right? By choosing which way they want to go with their education. Having independent access to learning resources. They like to know that they're there and they want to access them on their own time, at their own leisure. Also, cross-disciplinary alignment. This is something that we've been doing in a course, English 225. In fact, in all of our English courses in the Academic Engagement Center, our first year sequence of courses, in getting students to learn college writing, right? Personal research, analytical writing, while addressing their intended majors, or their intended careers. So we're relating the skill, writing, what they're learning, to the discipline that they are matriculating into. So that this is, again, going back to that first bullet point, relevant, right? This is relevant to them. And it also feels personal when they get to bring their own interest into the practice of learning a skill. Again, we need to align learning outcomes with relevant skills. This, again, is that relevance and pragmatism, right? I'm learning this, but why? Why am I learning it? What does it serve? What purpose does it serve for me now and in the future? We also need to foster learning communities. And this is one thing that we're doing in a number of our courses, and more as we build them, in using live learning sessions, bringing students together from all weeks of enrollment. So we have students enrolled in week 1, students enrolled in week 2, 3, 4, 5, coming together with a faculty member to address content, questions, concerns, but really ultimately to create a learning community, to let students know that they're part of a larger learning community, which is difficult in the online sphere. We need to offer co-curricular development opportunities. These are clubs, associations, extracurricular, but co-curricular spaces for students to, again, feel part of a community and further develop skills. And also direct access to mental health services. And this is something that we do in our Student Support Center and have available in every classroom as a one-touch point of contact for students.
Yeah, that's
Next
great.
slide.
And yeah, James, I'll just
Go
add to
ahead.
that we do have access to 24/7 counseling for students. And if anybody in here has access to that link and you can post it in the chat, that'd be great. I know I post an announcement in the classroom when I teach so that students can access that here at UAGC. All right. So that brings us to our Q&A. I'm happy that we have a good chunk of time for that. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing. Okay. So yes, so Kate, I don't know if there were any questions that came through Whova. I keep wanting to call it Wova. That's not what it is. It's Whova. Any questions that came through there or through the chat? Or I really want to just invite anyone to unmute and share with us, what are you noticing when you're teaching? Do you have students who seem to be younger and younger than perhaps in years past? What are you noticing from them? Do they seem to have learning needs that are different than other students you've had in the past?
I see a hand, Ming-Zhen.
Yes, first of all, I just want to thank my wonderful, wonderful colleagues for such an inspiring and timely presentation. I do have a question, and maybe it's a discussion question for everybody here. So, I mean, we usually say that 3 generations under one roof is such a beautiful thing, right? I think it's universal. So now we have multiple generations in one classroom, in one session. Considering student behaviors in terms of their learning styles, their needs, right? They're all classroom behaviors. Could James and Jen, if you two could kind of talk about how can we promote a diverse and inclusive learning environment or learning experience for all students in terms of actually, I know you talk about curriculum and co-curriculum development already. So I will say maybe focusing on pedagogy and peer environment perspectives.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And we know when working with adults, we talk about andragogy in terms of what are the best ways that adults like to learn. But I think we are seeing though that these are adults technically, but they're very young adults, and their life experiences are quite different than our generation or the baby boomers that preceded them. I would just say that in general, when it comes to andragogy, one of the key pieces is choice. Sort of regardless of the age or generation of the student, adults like to have choice in what they're doing. So I think as much of that as you can have in the course, the better. So that would be my suggestion. James, what do you think?
I'd agree with that. That's something that we pointed out that Gen Z students need for their learning styles. But I think it's also something that many generations of students like. I know that when I was a student, I enjoyed having choice, the ability to sort of self-direct. But I know also that that's not for everyone. And some students like to have everything mapped out for them. Some students like to have, their hands held more than others, and some like to learn more independently. And I think really that comes down to pedagogy, right? To andragogy, to the teacher, facilitating content, making that content available to students in the ways that best serve them, and seeing each student as an individual learner with individual needs.
Oh, thank you. Haley just posted in the chat that information about that student assistance program that I mentioned earlier. Thank you so much. Which is, great not only for Gen Z students, but for all of our students.
For everyone.
Yes. So I'd love to hear anybody share about their experiences teaching, if you've noticed any particular needs or concerns or issues that you have with our younger group of students, or any students that you might teach.
In the absence of a question for the time being, I'll say that I've personally noticed anxiety coming up more and more, right? Students being more anxious about how they're doing, about grades, about whether they're able to get assignment in on time, because they also have so many other plates spinning simultaneously. And I see that coming up more and more. Emails that I receive from students are coming, I think, from a place of anxiety. And I think how we negotiate really important and speaks so much to those of we who are teaching in the classroom, how we make space and hold space for those students, and address them where they are, to make them feel safe, make them feel heard, seen, and give them the tools they need to feel comfortable succeeding, right? Being comfortable succeeding, I think that's difficult for a lot of people.
James and Jen, I didn't see anything necessarily in the Whova app, but I was wondering if, this is a very academic crowd, and there's nothing we academics love more than to dive deeper into information. Wondering if there are specific resources that you found as you were doing research for this presentation, or any directions maybe that you could guide attendees to do a little bit deeper dive into supporting Gen Z learners.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Kate. And I'll answer, and then I'm going to go look for a link and post in the chat for you. We both found the greatest source of information was on the Pew Research Center's website. So a very credible source of information about this generation. So I'll post a note there. And James, I know you had mentioned you had perused some books about Gen Z in college.
Right. I found a few books. However, they appear to have been written, say, 5 years ago, or published 5 years ago, and maybe aren't still as current as we would hope they are. But we're specifically addressing Gen Z students, so I can pull those up and share if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I think, one of the great things about a conversation that the two of you have brought up is, how do we continue to learn more, and how do we continue to not just have this conversation at TLC, but how do we continue to have this conversation throughout the year? So I really appreciate you adding those additional resources, but also, let's say we have an attendee that maybe isn't part of our institution. Any suggestions on how you'd either have them bring up ideas as a faculty member or as a staff member about, looking at that generation as a unique set of learners that need support?
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't mention is, we're not Gen Z. Just because we have children that are in that generation does not make us experts. So one thing I would always encourage people to do is to ask, check in with them. I mean, even my own, one who's a junior in college right now, to check in and say, does this resonate with you? Does this seem like an accurate representation of who you are? And we've had these conversations, and he says, yes, it does. So I guess I would say, if you had an opportunity to do some focus groups with some students and who are in that generation, ask them, what are your learning needs? How are we meeting those needs? What could we improve upon? I think that's always a great idea.
Right. I'd echo that. And, in my last panel, we were talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion as an iterative process. I think generations are by their nature iterative, right? So how we address students, how we prepare for students, how we accommodate students and support them, ultimately, how we support them in their success, is an iterative process. We're never going to do it perfectly. We're always going to be playing catch up to a certain extent. But I think the more that we can be prepared by having these conversations, by talking about our students that we have, the better we can serve them.
Absolutely. And how even as a generation isn't a monolith, right? Especially the ones on the edges. They're kind of a mix of both. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen and James. Thank you to our audience for attending today's session. We encourage you to attend the next keynote presentation, Dr. Adriana Kazar, which takes place at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Other than that, please enjoy the rest of your TLC. Thanks all.
Thank you.